Chapter 37 is looking at the 1950s through the Eisenhower era with the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952. Now, to begin with, in 1952, the Democrats nominated Adalai Stevenson. He was the governor of Illinois at the time. He was very bookish looking. Contrast that then to the Republican nominee of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander of Europe in World War II, and his vice presidential nominee, Richard Nixon. Remember, Richard Nixon had really made a national name for himself, hunting out the communists in Congress. And really, television and advertising is going to play a huge role in the 1952 election. Campaign slogans like "I like Ike." Ike is a nickname for Eisenhower. Televised ads with jingles and cute little songs going on really promote this idea of Eisenhower as the one to beat. He is a war hero, he has a good image, etc. Also playing into the failures of the Democrats in Korea at this point really scare people into voting for the Eisenhower ticket anyway. However, all of this was very quickly, or could have quickly been, squashed for Nixon because there was a minor scandal during the campaign with him as the VP candidate, that there was a possibility that people were sending him money, or he was taking money from illegal campaign contributions and putting them in a quote-unquote slush fund. He was able to divert attention away from this when he gave his pretty famous checkers speech, as it's called. This is an absolutely ridiculous speech. It is basically said, "I've never received anything from anyone. My wife wears a very plain, simple gray coat. We've never taken anything except for a little dog, and we named her Checkers, and my daughters love her, and we're never going to give her back." And it's absolutely ridiculous, but by warming the hearts of the American people, people kind of moved beyond this potential catastrophe for Nixon, and he was able to remain on the Republican ticket for 1952. So, combining the political advertising, combining Eisenhower's war hero status, the sound bites that were being used, and the commercialization of the 1952 election, Eisenhower easily defeated Adalai Stevenson with 442 electoral votes to 89. And the 1950s, like I said before, there are a lot of correlations between this and the 1920s. And this is somewhat of a return to normalcy. Let's get back to the way things, quote-unquote, used to be before the war had come about. Here you see Eisenhower campaigning. Him and Nixon at the Republican nomination, and that's Mamie Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower's wife. Here is the presidential electoral count. All right. So we talk about the 1950s as this return to normalcy, but happening all at the same time. The Cold War is going on. The fight for civil rights is all going on. We're going to talk about each of those things. And our fear of communism spreads more than just overseas, but that fear is also coming home. And we've already talked about that a little bit with the HUAC hearings. And the loyalty review boards from the last chapter. Probably one of the most well-known examples of this fear of communism at home comes from Senator Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was pretty much a failure of a senator at this time, and he's looking for something to campaign on so that he can be re-elected. And so jumping on this anti-communist bandwagon, this Wisconsin senator one day gives this speech where he says, very famously, that in his pocket he has a list of 205 known communists in the State Department. And this really jumpstarts this witch hunt, this fear of communism. Who's a communist? What are they doing? What effect? Are they spying on the United States? You know, we've already talked about this. The fear of communism is real, especially since the Soviet Union has acquired these nuclear capabilities. So Joseph McCarthy makes a name for himself and very quickly becomes one of the most powerful men within the U.S. government because no one can challenge him because all he needs to do is point to them and call them a communist and their lives are over. Now, he never actually divulged his list of 205 communists, and every time he gave a new speech, that number changed. So it's probably not at all possible that he had any communists on any sheet anywhere. He was just using this as a tactic to gain more power. And really, this also adds to this communist hysteria that communist now equals traitor to the United States. And with that, this era of McCarthyism really applies to all of these things. McCarthyism becomes the generic term, not just aimed at what Joseph McCarthy was doing, but aimed at all the focus on communists here in the United States. And so after gaining some of this power, and it really does go to his head, in 1954 he went on to attack the Army, saying that the Army at this time was full of communists. The Army-McCarthy hearings were held on television, where he would bring leading members of the armed forces and essentially badger them into what they know, who they know, etc. And so the tide starts to turn against McCarthy, because here he is badgering war heroes, and he looks honestly crazy on television. Add to that, one of the most famous news broadcasters of this day, named Edward R. Murrow, attacked McCarthy's tactics. He said, quote, "We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty." And the tide starts to change. Public opinion starts to change. Eventually, he is dismissed as a kook. He is actually censured by the Senate, which is basically a slap on the wrist for, quote, "conduct unbecoming a member of the Congress," and he died of alcoholism in 1957. But like I said, McCarthyism really refers to this entire era of hysteria. Here is a political cartoon of Senator McCarthy extinguishing liberty's flame. Here you see the one side, this is that fear of communism, that propaganda, and on the other side, there's the Republican elephant made to stand on top of this very shaky foundation of McCarthyism. So like I said, the 1950s is a very strange era, because there's a lot of things going on at the exact same time. This Cold War is raging. This fear of communism is raging. Issues overseas, changes here at home, and also the beginning of the civil rights movement. In 1950, just to give you an example, there were 50 million black people living in the United States, and even with all of the mass migrations that they've gone through, 2/3 of them still live in the South. Now down South, as we've referenced way back in the day after Reconstruction, they are still facing Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are segregation by law. These are de jure segregation laws, meaning they were required to go to separate schools. They were required to sit in separate areas of public places like train stations or waiting rooms or movie theaters. It was all required by law. And also, through shady tactics, they were denied voting rights. And we've talked about all this before. Poll taxes, literacy tests, requirement for property ownership, and just sheer intimidation all lead to the disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South. For example, in the Deep South, they were about 20% of all potential black Southern voters. However, that only accounts for 5% of the voters that were actually engaged. They were too scared or unable to go and register to vote. So this issue really gets going around 1955. A boy from Chicago, a black boy from Chicago named Emmett Till, he was 14 years old, had been visiting his father in Mississippi. And allegedly, and this is where the matter gets shaky, he had whistled at a white woman while walking home one day. Obviously, 14-year-old boys don't make good decisions, especially ones that come from the North and are not used to these customs. That night, Emmett Till was dragged from his grandfather's house. He was beaten, shot, and thrown in a river by the woman's husband and brother. The killers were acquitted, and his mother, horrified at what had happened to her son, required an open casket funeral to show the world what had happened to her child because of discrimination. This really starts to open people's eyes, but there is a long way to go. Also in 1955, Rosa Parks, probably one of the most prominent African Americans in the civil rights movement, was riding home from her job in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, once again, segregation required her to sit in the back of the bus, but it also required her that once the white section of the bus became filled, she would have to give up her seat to a white person. She was ordered by the bus driver to give up her seat. She refused and was arrested. Now, what some people don't know is that that all of this was planned. Rosa Parks was part of a civil rights organization looking to bring attention to this discrimination down south. So this event is going to jumpstart the modern civil rights movement, starting with the Montgomery bus boycott led by Dr. Martin Luther King. For 382 days, African Americans in the city of Montgomery refused to ride their public busing system, trying to hurt the bus company right where it hurts them the most, in the pocketbook, because they were losing tons and tons of money. Martin Luther King, and we'll talk about this more and more later, demanded that these be non-violent protests, and we'll see why that's so important later on. In 1948, Truman had already desegregated the military, and we start to see a change in the Supreme Court as well with the creation of the Warren Court. Earl Warren was named to be Chief Justice by the new President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a moderate Republican, picked Earl Warren thinking he would also be a moderate Republican as well. Earl Warren turned out to be way more liberal than Eisenhower expected, and so his court, which would last for years and years and years, is really going to focus on judicial activism, using the power of the courts to change society. And this is where a lot of the change in society is going to come from. Here you see the arrest warrant for Rosa Parks on the left, and on the right this is a propaganda photo, obviously after the Montgomery bus boycott ended and the busing was desegregated, her sitting in front of a white man. Here is once again that segregation, those Jim Crow laws requiring separate entrances for African Americans compared to whites, and what was waiting for African Americans should they, quote, get out of their place. So under the Warren Court, one of the most major and profound changes to come to the United States is in 1954. In a unanimous landmark ruling, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus the Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. Now, here's what had happened. The NAACP had brought this case before the Supreme Court to be litigated by up-and-coming African-American lawyer Thurgood Marshall. He would later be the first African-American justice on the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall, arguing against Plessy versus Ferguson. If you remember, Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896 had said that as long as the accommodations are equal, separate is okay, separate but equal. Thurgood Marshall argued that no matter what, no matter how equal these accommodations were, even if the black school was better, separate is inherently unequal because it creates psychological damage in the minds of the kids that they are being forced to be separated. The Supreme Court ruled that this is a violation of the 14th Amendment. And they also ordered, not just in the case of the city of Topeka, Kansas, which is where this case originated from, that all schools were to desegregate with, quote, all deliberate speed. Now, this created instant resistance in the South. Congressmen urging their states to resist desegregation. And even though we always talk about Brown versus the Board as being this event that starts the desegregation of schools, and it absolutely does, it is a slow process. It's not like the next day they woke up and everything was desegregated. In fact, in 1964, less than 2% of the schools in the Deep South actually had abided by the Brown versus Board ruling. So it's going to be a long process. One of the first challenges to the court's ruling comes in 1957. The Little Rock, Arkansas School Board had decided to try desegregating one of their high schools with Central High School. They handpicked 9 African-American students, the best of the best among the community, to start this desegregation process. The entire state of Arkansas freaked out about this proposed desegregation with just 9 students coming. And so Orville Faubus, who was the governor of Arkansas at this time, bowing to pressure and obviously always keeping his eye on re-election, sent in the National Guard to stop these children from walking into Little Rock High School. So waiting for them on their first day was a massive white mob and men with guns stopping them from walking into school. Now, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who wasn't 100% behind the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. He thought that it was too much too soon, was even more against a governor openly denying a federal court's ruling. And so Dwight D. Eisenhower sent in the 101st Airborne to escort these 9 children to their classes and to protect them from the mob. Later, he federalized the National Guard, and each of these 9 kids had a guardsman with them every single day for the rest of the year. To force the desegregation issue. Little Rock responded the next year by closing 3 of their high schools as opposed to desegregating. They were going to deny this no matter what. Here you see one of the students, her name was Elizabeth Eckford, being screamed at by the mob. Here you see the students being escorted by the National Guard once they were federalized. And here is the mob waiting for these 9 students when they arrive at school. So, in 1957, as people start to recognize that, hey, there's a problem here that we have been ignoring since Reconstruction ended, Congress finally got back into the business of passing laws to protect African Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 is a very, very mild Civil Rights Act, and it doesn't actually do a whole lot, but it's important because Congress is finally opening its eyes. It's being pressured into changing, providing some mild voting rights for African Americans in the United States. It was faced with a 24-hour filibuster by Strom Thurmond. Remember, Strom Thurmond is a pro-segregationist, and he wanted to try to stop this from occurring. But nonetheless, progress is going to continue on. In 1957, after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. This is probably one of the most important civil rights organizations at this time. And really, it's an organization of black Southern churches, ministers like him, etc., promoting nonviolent protest. Now, this is going to be important because the idea here is to draw national attention to the blatant disregard for civil rights. And the only way to get people to open their eyes is to sit quietly, to sit passively, to march, to protest in a peaceful manner, because the white people are going to respond very negatively. They're going to look like the fools compared to the African Americans who are protesting in a non-violent way. And the idea is that change will come as a result. In 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 black college students decided to try out this idea of nonviolent protest. They were not affiliated with the SCLC, though. Sitting down at a Woolworth's lunch counter, which was a segregated lunch counter, and demanded service. They were attacked. They had food and drinks poured on them. They were verbally assaulted, physically assaulted, but they just sat there quietly asking to be served at this segregated lunch counter. This is going to jumpstart a whole movement known as the sit-in movement that is going to spread across the United States, demanding for an end to the segregation in these areas. And with the success of the sit-in movement, another organization was formed in April of 1960, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. These are mostly college-age students, once again pushing for civil rights. And one of their main ways of doing that in the early years was through this sit-in movement. Here you see, this is later on, members of SNCC being attacked for sitting at a segregated lunch counter. Here is Martin Luther King and his wife being arrested. Martin Luther King was arrested several times for disturbing the peace, or for whatever reason it was, through his non-violent protests. Okay, let's take a look now at what's also going on concurrently with the Cold War. So under Eisenhower, his Secretary of State is named John Foster Dulles. They've named an airport after him. And he really is going to promote this idea of containment, but he is going to take it a step further. A policy of mutually assured destruction, or the policy of Brinkmanship. Basically, the idea is we are going to build so many nuclear weapons it is not even going to be funny. Then the Soviet Union will probably build up all of their nuclear weapons. So the idea is if we go to war, we are basically assured that both of us are going to be completely destroyed. And because of this, we will maintain peace in a very weird way. Brinkmanship is also the idea of going to the brink of war and just looking over but not actually falling in. So in a weird way, we maintain peace by going to almost certain death. So this is really going to be the policy under Eisenhower, to build up our military arsenal with nuclear weapons. But at the same time, Eisenhower is trying to, in some ways, ease these Cold War tensions. Meeting with the new leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin has recently died. The new leader is named Nikita Khrushchev at the Geneva summit in 1955. Here he is trying to advocate a policy of open skies, meaning let's each fly over each other's territory and see what's going on. Khrushchev says absolutely not. They talked about free trade. That also broke down. Arms reductions. That didn't really work out too well. But it is to some degree setting the groundwork for future discussions as well. And after Khrushchev came to power, actually, he had criticized some of Stalin's oppressiveness. He advocated for a policy of de-Stalinization. Hungary, which was one of the satellite nations, says, okay, well, it seems like Khrushchev is going to be a much softer, kinder type dictator, and so they attempted to leave the Warsaw Pact to test this theory to see if he would actually be a kinder sort of dictator. Khrushchev resorted to very Stalinistic tactics, sending in the USSR military and crushing this plan to leave the Warsaw Pact. So the United States really failed Hungary by only sending food and medicine. We were fearful that this would have resulted in World War III. And here you see Soviet tanks rolling through Hungary as a result.